Hello, everybody. It's a real pleasure for me to introduce now the next plenary speaker, Amanda Vincent. She got her PhD in the University of Cambridge, and then she has several stays in Sweden, Germany, and also in the University of Oxford in England. And then she moved to Canada, first to Montreal, and then now she's in the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, and she has been really involved in marine conservation, and mostly she's the chief of the seahorses conservation in marine science. So, Amanda.
Okay. A ver.
¿Está bien? Gracias. Okay, so here's my starting point. Out there, through the extremely bright light, I see a whole mess of amazing people, fantastic people. You, I, we, we're very good scientists. We have very strong hearts, minds, souls. We're really quite good at what we do. That's our starting point. But what I want to take you is to a different place. I want to take you to a place where we're actually going to make a difference in this world. We're all quite obsessed, I think, with aquatic things, aquatic life, aquatic systems, and we know that those aquatic systems are often in serious trouble. We are extremely well positioned to make notable differences in their future, and of course directly in our future by so doing. We should be clear that there is absolutely no chance of perfect advice in anything we do in management and policy. Our very best expectation is imperfect advice. But what we tend to do is default to no advice at all, simply because we're very frightened or very uncertain about how to go forward. And the recognition that there is no such thing as perfect advice, that this is always a wild dance where the problems are evolving and the solutions are emerging and we're feeling our way somewhat in the dark, should actually free us up amazingly to engage in policy. Perhaps one of the biggest obstacles is we're always looking over our shoulder as to what our peers will think. Well, personally, I'm less worried about what my peers think about my translation of science into policy than I am worried about the state of the universe and the state of our oceans. So I think it's really vital that we get over that sense of fear and help to make a difference fairly quickly. It's become interesting to me that mountains of data are beginning to be equated with scholarship. That advanced statistical analyses represent the best that science has to offer. And I would say that in many ways, scholarship and scientific endeavor is so much more than that. It's know-how, definitely. We need the information. But it's the capacity to take that know-how and that information and to transform it into meaningful input into societal dialogue that actually represents the full capacity of scholarship. So if you're going to tweet this meeting, I'd like you to tweet that we shouldn't just collect data, but we should do something with it. And do something with it quite immediately. So I'm going to take you on a voyage today. It's an extremely personal voyage, as I turn from being originally a seahorse biologist into being involved at the highest levels of global policy. It's been a messy voyage. There's been lots of opportunities, lots of frustrations, but I can tell you throughout that the progress we made in effecting change was never limited by our scientific knowledge, not once. Might have been limited sometimes by our courage to deploy it, but that's a very different matter. So we're going to start this voyage with a roadmap. What we need desperately is joined up thinking. We need to take our understanding of spaces and species and systems and translate it all the way out to the global policy endeavor. If you want, I'm going to take my little world, which is seahorses, and if you want to do something good for seahorses, you've got to also do something good for their habitats and their ecosystems. And to do that, you're going to have to work with the people who are most dependent on those species and spaces: the fishers, the miners, the dredgers, the coastal developers. And to make any difference there, you're going to have to make sure that you're respectful of the fact that they need their families fed, their kids in school, and basic law and order in their communities. And to do that, you're going to have to work with layers of government on economic and policy endeavors, whether it be local, regional, national, or global. And so therefore you have to connect all these dots, recognizing you've got concentric rings of pressure bearing down on the seahorses, in my case, in the center of my scheme. But I suspect nobody else in this room has the same obsession with seahorses. So I invite you to put whatever you care most about in the center of this onion world. And it could be a particular process, or a particular microorganism, or a particular toxicant you're working with. And imagine that if you were to effect change globally, you'd have to be cognizant of all these different layers of engagement, all these different layers of pressure that bear down on your particular concern. And to release them, you have to deal with policy. Policy is everywhere, and policy doesn't stop because we fail to engage with it. Policy continues to advance and effect and exert its pressure, its impact on all of us, even if we stay well clear of engaging with it ourselves. So I'm taking on a voyage now that's a very personal one, but in it you should sense your own capacity to make material difference at the management and policy levels. So this is the Good Ship Project Seahorse, which is one of the teams I run. And Project Seahorse sets sail. In this case, it's just going to have one crew member, me, but in fact, there's quite a lot of collaborators and team members on a voyage to try to look at seahorses. So it all started very calmly. It all started very happily. I spent a lot of time underwater, very rhapsodical sunset and sunrise cruises that led to watching seahorses in mangroves. Got underwater and watched seahorses in coral reefs. Got very involved with seagrass habitats where the seahorses make their homes. And all through this, enjoyed very much looking at the animals and their relationship to the environment. So that was a very fulfilling period when all of a sudden, crashing into this bucolic scene, came the realities of life. These are trawlers. Trawlers scrape the bottom of the ocean, gathering everything in their path. The single easiest change we can all make for the ocean is to refuse to eat any product that comes up from bottom trawls. It's an extraordinarily damaging form of trawling, destructive, unacceptable, horrific. To give you a sense of how damaging it is, with the seahorses, most trawl boats only catch one seahorse per vessel per night. Insignificant, you might think, until you realize that when you add this all up, you actually get extractions from countries like Vietnam of 5 million seahorses a year. From Thailand, even larger numbers of millions of seahorses a year. Think about what that represents in terms of the bottom trawling, the scraping and extraction that goes on around the world. And add to that the fact that the target species usually constitute 5 to 15% of the trawl take now, and the other 85 to 95% is stuff we didn't mean to get. And more on that later. Truly tricky issue. But this is what a trawl looks like. I didn't realize that you guys are looking at empty image. This is what a trawl catch looks like. You've got one seahorse and a whole lot of other stuff you didn't mean to get. But we started actually by focusing on the small-scale fishers. The fishers that actually catch seahorses in order to meet their subsistence needs. So these are fishers who go out morning, noon, and night catching whatever they can, with seahorses providing significant portions of their cash income now. Nobody chooses to catch seahorses as a primary take. Therefore, we have to assume that most seahorse fishers have already dealt with highly degraded environments and have already had hugely depleted fisheries, and they're forced into seahorses largely as an option of last recall. So we obviously have to take action once we realize that these fisheries are significant. Over time, we came to understand that there were massive depletions of seahorse populations around the world. Massive depletions. Now, we didn't have all the data or all the information, but what we had is what Michael Pace would call an early warning sign. Everywhere we could detect anything, we found that we were really getting a loss of populations, catch per unit effort declining, significant concerns about habitat destruction. And when you've got early warnings, you really need to come up with early responses. One of my great worries is that we're so good at detecting problems as a community, a scientific community, and we're so wretchedly bad at proposing solutions for the most part. And we're even more worryingly bad at actually turning those solutions into something that is practical, feasible, plausible. And it makes the relationship between science and management and policymakers extremely difficult at times, because we need to be willing to offer technical support. So we started by proposing marine protected areas, no fishing zones, no take zones. And we managed to implement a lot of those. In the Philippines, where we started our work, entirely through Filipino biologists and social workers, I emphasize that, and social workers, we were able to generate 35 no-take marine protected areas, all locally managed and locally enforced. And those are mostly in effect still today, and they have had measurable increases in the fish sizes, species, and biomass within these reserves. So the marine reserves were a very good starting point. But they don't cover most of the ocean, and any sense that we can depend on marine protected areas and marine reserves is obviously missing the reality that we've got the rest of the ocean to address as well. Particularly in situations as we had in the Philippines, we have tremendous poverty, tremendous desperation, where people are going to continue extracting till that last animal simply because there is no other option, there is no other choice. So we began to realize that just working at the supply end of the story was not going to be enough. And we start to look at those outer concentric rings of pressure. We start to deal with national governments and national rules and regulations, absolutely. But we realize we've got to go to the producing countries. So we head off to Hong Kong, which is one of the great trading centers of marine wildlife, well, wildlife in general, as well as many other commodities. And in Hong Kong, we find that the trade is truly gigantic. So you'll see, oops, didn't mean to do that, or that. So you'll see one of our team members with a pile of seahorses there. That's more dried seahorses than I've seen in a lifetime of working on seahorses. The trade was absolutely enormous, flooding in from around the world. We now know there are 80 countries involved in exporting seahorses and importing seahorses. Seahorses are found, 47, 48 species, in pretty much all the temperate and tropical waters of the world, shallow waters at least, but down to about 100 to 200 meters now as well. So we've got a global problem on our hands very suddenly, and we've got to address it at a global scale. This takes us into whole new domains. We realize we're going to have to start dealing with the multilateral environmental agreements. We're going to have to start dealing with global trade dynamics. We're going to have to find a way to reduce the extraction pressure on these animals, even as we work on remedial action, like size management measures in fisheries or like marine protected areas. So very soon, I, who was a seahorse biologist interested in the evolution of sex differences, suddenly find myself in defense of the species and spaces that I love so much, required to play on the international global policy stage. And frightening that can be indeed. We turned our attention primarily to CITES, which is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. CITES is a UN convention with about 180 nations, and CITES is the agency, or the convention, if you will, behind things like the ban on rhino horn trade, rhino trade at all, the ban on elephant trade, the ban on orchid trade, and so on. So it seemed like a reasonable place to start. CITES has 3 different levels of controls. One level of control is indeed a total ban on extraction and international trade, for international trade. The second is regulation whereby international trade is restricted to levels that will not damage wild populations, which on the face of it is incredibly sensible. Don't let your international trade damage your wild populations. So it's in that context that we thought we might find a way to work with CITES. There was a suggestion that seahorses ought to be brought under that appendix in 1989. And rather to people's surprise, I fought very hard against that at the time. And the reason I fought against it was because we didn't have enough technical knowledge, 1, but 2, and very importantly, we didn't have buy-in. We didn't have any form of dialogue going. And why did this matter? Well, because CITES, as with so many other management measures, treats marine species as other. Marine fishes are seldom accorded the same respect that you would accord to any other wildlife, any other species that's terrestrially based, or even marine mammals. So CITES had systematically refused to engage with marine fishes of conservation concern or to regulate their trade, simply claiming that that wasn't their domain or their purview, but it should stay with the Food and Agriculture Organization. It's very shaky waters to be stepping into when you're going to deal with marine fisheries and you know that this is hugely combative. So therefore, we decided to take a break and just discuss the issues without yet proposing formal sanctions. However, eventually the time came when we felt we had lined up enough data, far from comprehensive data, but enough data, and that we had enough buy-in, and that I had chaired working groups for the UN for long enough that I had some sort of respectability in that context. And we actually decided we would propose an Appendix 2 listing that is controls of exports of these animals for the 180 countries, well, 169 at that point. And we went to one of the major CITES meetings in Santiago, Chile in 2002. And there we found anger, we found true vehemence. No way were marine fishes going to be treated as other wildlife commodities under this convention. There was such anger that many of the proposals to list marine fishes had to be pulled off the agenda and all the others were defeated. But rather remarkably, perhaps because of the careful way we'd gone about it, a non-combative, non-confrontational approach, we actually found that there was some potential for seahorses to be listed. And we got that convention to agree that the first ever global trade restrictions on marine fishes would indeed be for seahorses. Shortly after that, 2 defeated proposals for the 2 shark species were brought back, and they too were added to the list of globally regulated species because now CITES did engage with marine fishes of conservation concern. So the seahorses set a precedent that, as I will explain, is continuing to be felt around the world. There were many, many aspects to why we were successful with this, but it's certainly true that science was the least of it. And yet even that's not quite fair. We had mountains of information, an extraordinary amount of knowledge. But in a sense, in a policy arena, what you'll find is that your scientific knowledge, your technical knowledge is a bit like an iceberg. You have to know really a lot, but you only ever deploy about 10% or less. And you always have enough reserve that you can fill the gaps in that 10% if needed. So we worry too much about our data knowledge, whereas in fact the amount that you actually are required to deploy is often very, very limited. It's a case of choosing strategically how to explain and influence a policy agenda. So we now had a CITES listing, which is great. But that's far from the game over. As soon as you've got a listing, as soon as you've got a piece of paper, as soon as you've got a policy, all you've got is a notion that there's a willingness to act. And then you need to turn this into something very real, whatever your pursuit, whatever your agreement, whatever your law, whatever your convention. So fairly quickly we decided to ask CITES to verify whether countries were doing what they were meant to do, which is actually regulating the export to ensure that it was not damaging wild populations. And that was an extraordinarily tricky thing to do, actually. CITES was willing to ask all the countries whether they'd met their obligations. The parties were quite willing to explain why they felt they had met their obligations. It became abundantly clear they had not. Whereupon, in a meeting hall rather larger than this, I was asked in half an hour, with half an hour's notice, to make recommendations for those countries so they could change their regulatory regimes for management and export. And this is what we who are academic scientists fail to realize, that managers actually have to make proposals. They actually have to make decisions. They actually have to effect change. And one of the more terrifying moments of my life was standing there with half an hour's notice to write policies that would be diktats, requirements, and recommendations for the governments of Thailand, the government of Vietnam, the government of Senegal, and so on. In such situations like that, you usually turn to first principles, and our instincts are good. We have the capacity to develop things from first principles. So we recommended, for example, that bluntly, parties live up to their existing international obligations, and CITES become a tool to force them to establish the marine protected areas they'd already promised under the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Aichi targets. That CITES forced them to justify the implementation of their own laws and regulations, such as bans on trawl fishing within 5 kilometers or 10 kilometers of the coast. It was very possible for us to draw on existing basic principles and require that they be implemented in order to support the needs of the seahorses and the other marine fishes. And that's the other thing we have to remember, that we're not developing policy or management recommendations with a blank slate. There's a huge amount of work out there that we can draw on and adapt. And frankly, detail and nuance only comes into play rather later in the game. So we actually had a way forward. We were able to make a number of recommendations that were very pragmatic, that were very back of the envelope calculations, and that were rules of thumb. And that's okay, something we forget. But almost never do we need detailed, highly refined, very elaborate guidance for policy until we get to implementing rules and regulations that comes later in a policy framework, and sometimes not even then. So CITES actually is unusual in international conventions, multilateral conventions, because it actually has an enforcement capacity. It can insist that parties do what they've said they're going to do. And it's in that context we managed to generate the first ever export ban on any marine fish in the world at any time. And that is now setting precedent for a whole number of other regulatory changes. We work in Vietnam, assisting them to manage their trawl fisheries, which are creating such havoc for the marine environment in general. And thank you, we'll use seahorses as symbolic animals to try to get that under control. And we're working with them on a host of biodiversity planning and coastal zoning and so on. It's odd, to my mind, that seahorses should be the engine for so much of this, but as I say, CITES is about the only global convention in our game that actually has regulatory enforcement capacity. The rest works largely on naming and shaming, or hopefully naming and praising, and it's something we can still generate action from, but it's a bit trickier. And we're also working extensively in Thailand right now, where it's particularly complicated because the Thai Department of Fisheries doesn't actually have a single fisheries manager, despite being one of the biggest fishing nations in the world. We also have realized that we're going to have to come back in a big way to deal with this issue of bottom trawling writ large. Thailand has been somewhat willing to engage in making change, not overly enthusiastic, but somewhat receptive. But as long as you have bottom trawling, you've got a really serious problem. And what we've discovered for bottom trawling is that the bottom trawling in Thailand no longer targets any species at all. It now sets out to extract life itself from the ocean. Trawl fisheries there are not directed at shrimp for the most part. They're directed at carbon, life. And that is now reduced for fish meal and fish oil or animal feed and goes into aquaculture for the most part, which should theoretically give us a chance to exert influence over it through consumer choice and through the emerging seafood sustainability trade. And that is that capture of a low-grade product that goes into aquaculture is only possible because of subsidies that keep those fisheries going. And those subsidies are fuel subsidies and labor subsidies. It now turns out that many of the trawl fishing vessels in Thailand are actually crewed by slave labor. So we suddenly have this juxtaposition between slave labor, ecological concerns, and major trade commodity routes that we're very engaged in now, trying to find a leverage point to effect change in all of those dimensions. It's big, it's bold, and it's a long way from seahorses, per se. So we do have all sorts of ways forward. We've been able to set in place a lot of guidance and toolkits for parties to make a difference. We've been able to set in place management regimes and protocols and procedures which are going to be really important in the very near future. Because seahorses set the precedent for CITES, and we've been able to generate a lot more action under CITES. So we had the seahorses, we had the basking shark and the whale shark, and now on top of that we have the sawfish, and we have the white shark, and we have the humphead wrasse, and most recently hammerhead sharks and oceanic white tips and so on. And we've been able, and the rays, the manta rays, all manta rays. So all of these species now are regulated to the point where exports are only permitted where they do not damage wild populations. It's an extraordinary gain, and we're trying to make sure that these paper conventions come to life. So what started as a little bit of seahorse biology has now turned into precedent-setting work that affects an awful lot of critical taxa and hopefully the ocean floor itself. We've realized that there's a limit to what we as a team can do. We're very few in number on my team, and we try to work globally. We're in fact responsible under the IUCN for 350 species, including all pipefishes and trumpet fishes and sticklebacks and God knows what else. So we've now also launched into citizen science, and we have major global initiatives trying to not just gather information from citizens, which is our normal interaction, but actually return the data in a way that empowers them to take local action. And they will be doing that with inadequate data, and we accept that reality. We have a choice now. We have imperfect action or none at all. So we now have, hopefully, a flotilla of small vessels starting to engage and support. On this voyage, there were two things I really want to point out that we took. One of those things was indeed this perspective of the onion world. Anything you're working on, I don't care what system, what issue, what idea, what focus any of you have for your research, is always going to be embedded in a much larger global context. And Tim's talk was connecting some of the smallest issues in the ocean to some of the biggest issues in the oceans in a really illustrative way. This will be true for everything. And if we just careen along with blinkers on our own particular issue without making the connections to the bigger world around us, our chance of influencing things is really quite limited. So working at all these layers of an onion is not necessarily a skill set, one can try, but it's certainly a mindset. And it's one that we're very slow to embrace, but we've got to be thinking about those connections all the time. And then the other thing I really want to highlight is the need for a great big bag of courage. And that courage comes in lots of different forms. One form is certainly to say to your peers, I got to stick my neck out on this one, and I'm going to be talking to the people who are my audience and not to you. And that can be a very difficult thing for us to do, particularly as young scientists. but it's critically important that we engage in that. And the one thing I would say is nobody who has ever been involved in the management of policy domains, and there are many people in this room who are very familiar with them, is going to criticize you for giving it a try as long as you're honest about the extent of your knowledge and where you're having to make interpretations. In the best form of adaptive management, it's absolutely fine to make a first stab at resolving a problem, noting that this will need to be adjusted as we go forward and learn more. So the bag of courage is really critical, not least when you're called upon to make recommendations to government with a moment's notice. So as we go forward, we need to keep in mind that scholarship is so much more than data collection, or data synthesis, or data analysis, or data publishing. Something that depresses me considerably is when I get to the end of a fine piece of work, whether it's a presentation, a poster, or a paper, and I read, so we need to collect more data. And that seems to be the punchline, so we need to collect more data. Because it's so dismissive of all of the knowledge, the effort, the money, the time, the collegiate support that we had to get to that stage. And I would beg that whenever we get to the end of a piece of work, in whatever form it takes, that we proudly declare a take-home message that is, to the best of our knowledge, realistic and tenable, and take for granted that we'll always need more data and that we cannot postpone and defer action until we have that seemingly nirvanic hope of all the data in the world and all the understanding in the world. So there's no doubt that there's a lot of change needed. There's no doubt that our ocean, our freshwater systems, that great connected flow of water and everything that lives within it is in great trouble. And if we're not going to take a leadership role in resolving that and responding to that, it's a little unclear to me who is going to do it. There is not a magic group of people that sits between science and policymakers, that sits between science and management. What we find is that scientists and managers are commonly working in two solitudes, failing to exchange information or guide each other in what should be a shared endeavor. So I leave you with the thought that policy is not scary, policy is omnipresent, management is not scary, it's omnipresent, and we're going to have to basically stick our necks out, grab what we have, and just get on with it. Thank you.